An old switcher sees service in a steel mill, and I weather most of it using AK Interactive's weathering pencils, coming up on JC's Rip Track. Hi there, my name is John, and welcome to JC's Rip Track, a place for advice and tips on adding realism to your model trains or modeling anything for that matter. If you're looking for ways to transform your plastic models into something that looks like it belongs on the rails today, then click on subscribe and that little bell icon to receive a notification every time there's a new video. So do you have a dedicated industry locomotive on your layout? How did you represent it? What sort of weathering did you do for it? Let me know in the comments section below. I've weathered a few locomotives for this channel, and each one has posed an exciting challenge or pushed me on trying some new techniques. Some of it is the environment. Where a locomotive sees service will affect the kind of weathering it has. On the other hand, engines that have long served on one road could be easily sold to local industries with only a necessary patch to show their new owners. This locomotive is a bit of both. When Will commissioned me to do this locomotive, he wanted an old Southern Pacific locomotive and patched it into the service for a steel mill on his layout. His directive to me was to make it look sad. Considerable weathering from its days in the Southern Pacific picked up and seeing some minor repairs when Union Pacific took over, but then sold off to a new task. Each step in the weathering process tells some part of that tale, which adds interest and tells the story of Will's layout. I decided to use AK Interactive products almost exclusively for this locomotive, especially their new weathering pencils line. It was a fun challenge, and as you will see, it gave me some great results. For a complete list of everything I used and where to get it, you can check it out by clicking on the show more in the video information below. So let's get to it. Preparing the model for weathering varies from piece to piece. When looking at the exploded diagram for the model, I realized that removing the shell would be more trouble than it's worth. So I chose just to remove the handrails, mask the windows using the foil candy wrap method, but leave the shell on for the mechanism, including the trucks. I demonstrated the foil candy wrapper method of masking on the N-Scale Skytop car last year. As a recap, the foil lining that comes in a red Lindor chocolate candy wrapper can be peeled away from the plastic, and then it can be applied and burnished onto clear plastic windows to provide an excellent mask that conforms to the shape. I usually cut it to the approximate size, peel the foil wrapper, and then apply the sticky side to the model, covering not just the window but all around it. I then burnish it with various tools, whether it's my finger or a rubber sculpting shaping tool or the protective foam that comes in many N-Scale locomotives. Once burnished into place, I then took a sharp number 11 blade, trimming around the windows, leaving only the windows with a shape conforming mask. As the first part of the process would include acrylic paint, I gave the model an Airbrush Clearcoat using AK Interactive's flat varnish. I wanted to provide the surface with some tooth so that the acrylic paint would have something to stick to. Weathering anything black is often a challenge because the starting color is as dark as it comes. I wanted to create a mottled faded look, but it would lend itself well to a hefty amount of rust chipping. When working with a model, especially with black paint, where rust is very heavy, the original paint will show heavy wear and tear when the paint hasn't chipped away. To do this on Will's model, I used Privateer Press's Thamar Black and Games Workshop's Skaven Blight Dinge and Storm Grown Fur. These are dirty gray colors designed to work together, while the black was to chip away at the stock letters and markings. Using a torn-up makeup sponge, I applied the acrylic paint to the model, focusing on the roof, the walkways, and the upper parts of the sides. I was aiming for a random look, but keeping things lighter towards the top of the model. My first foray with the weathering pencils on this model was to apply some rust color to the stacks and vents on the model. I ended up using a holding mount intended for miniatures as a way to hold the locomotive while I was still working on it. This is something that Games Workshop makes, and it was very handy in this circumstance, as it could hold the whole locomotive when I wasn't able to use my usual method of a toilet paper roll to work on a removed shell. For my first use of weathering pencils in this step, I wanted to use a wet application method using a few pencils from the Rust and Streaking set. This involves dipping the tip of a sharpened weathering pencil into water and then applying it to the model. However, I added just a tiny amount of Golden Acrylic's wetting agent to the water I was using. It breaks down the water's surface tension much like soap, but it doesn't leave any kind of residue, preventing water from beating up when applying it. It's an excellent investment to have when working with weathering pencils, no matter how you use it. The stuff is pretty strong, and I'm using just a small medicine cup for the water, and I used 1 drop of the wetting agent. I started with a dark rust pencil, wetting the tip, and then applying it around the base of the silver-colored exhaust stack. Occasionally I would dab off excess water on a regular sheet of paper, so I had a better control. I then moved on to the medium rust pencil, applying it over the previous step and blending it in with a darker color. Moving into the lighter shades, the light rust pencil worked best still with a wet tip, but by doing a light tapping motion, adding a few dots here and there on the parts that already had dark and medium rust. I then used the medium rust pencil to add a little bit of rust around the forward vents to add a little bit of color before going all in on the fading step, which would come next. I did a combination of drawing, using the pencil lead side on the vent's edges, and a light tapping motion to add some random dots on the vent tops. Moving to the fading step, I pulled the colors from both the black and white and blue and gray shading effects sets, and they worked towards a faded look that I wanted. Starting with the green-blue pencil, I did a wet application to create an accent around the upper panel edges. Green-blue is a perfect color for creating highlights on black coats that are a trick to an eye in order to keep it looking more black rather than gray, as regular gray highlights can do. However, on this model, I used it to create the illusion of heat damage, discoloring the paint, which is distinctive from sun fading. I then came in with a small paintbrush dampened in the same water with the wetting agent in order to blend what I had applied with the green-blue pencil. I wanted to blend the edges of the pencil, softening up the edges so that what I had used blended smoothly around where I had applied it. This would give it a more natural look. Next, I used the neutral gray pencil applied dry. I wanted an uneven distribution of pigment from the pencil, essentially scribbling the pencil onto the top of the locomotive with a higher concentration towards the top of the cab and the middle of the hood. Initially, this did not look very good, but I had the end result in mind. I used the dark gray weathering pencil to provide a darker blend out towards the cab and hood's edge. And my method here is just like coloring a drawing using pencil crayons, blending as I go. But this still looks very pencil-y, and my goal was to create patches of color that I would later smooth and blend. I should have done the darker shade first, but these pencils are very forgiving. I then used the dirty white pencil to highlight the middle of the hood and cab. Blending with the brush, I had to be careful to keep the brush damp, but not wet. While I did use the water treated with the wetting agent, I would dip the brush in the water, brush off the excess, and then use the dampness on the brush to blend the dry pencils that I had just applied. I worked to avoid having the blending water pooling anywhere on the model, so I'd sometimes dry the brush and then use the bristles to wick away any excess water. Doing it this way softens the penciled nature of the work and keeps it subtle. I find that fading with weathering pencils rivals the dot fading technique using oil paints, and it also blended well with the green-blue at the start of the step. After I let the previous step dry for a few minutes, I used the same technique to draw the fading down the locomotive sides. Again, this was a dry application, but this time starting with the dark gray, then moving to neutral gray, and then to dirty white, followed with the damp brush blending it all together. I mostly use downward strokes with the brush, but occasionally I had to soak the area, wick up the excess, and then do some more blending work. The last step for fading was to come back with a torn makeup sponge. I dipped it into the wet water from the previous steps and then dabbed most of the water out on a paper towel. I then dabbed the sponge over the areas where I had done the fading. This was to blend it further together and soften out any tide marks or an obvious pencil look formed in the previous steps. Visually, this step doesn't look like much in this video, but in places I found that it nicely softened the fade to what I needed it to be, a mottled rather than an even fade. As the next step would be using an enamel wash, I gave the model a clear coat using AK Interactive's Real Color Gloss Varnish. Once this dried, it was on to the Pinwash. Using the neutral gray wash from AK Interactive's Locomotive weathering set, I felt that the Locomotive needed a bit of a pinwash to give some panel and detail definition now that I had lightened the paint in the fading steps. This is an enamel wash, so setting things up, I made sure to be using the brushes for oil paints and pouring out a little bit of odorless mineral spirits to have handy for cleanup. The process is the same that I've described in other videos. Apply a light coat of odorless thinner on the model, using a small tip brush to apply small amounts of the wash to detail points and panel lines across the model. The thin nature of the wash pulls the pigment in and around the various bits of detail on the surface, providing contrast so that an observer can better see the detail. To get it looking right, I would need to let it dry a bit and then come back and soften it. Using a larger dry brush, I moved across the model to soften any hard lines left from when I applied the Pinwash. The idea is to get rid of any hard lines by using the dry brush to soften it. I first worked my way across the model this way, but there would be a few places that the Pinwash had dried a little too much, so that I would need to use some odorless thinner to fix these areas. I applied the thinner using the same small brush that I had applied with the original Pinwash, massaging the areas where too much of the wash had pooled and dried too much. I could then take the original brush and continue the softening process until I was happy with the results. Since I would be returning to the weathering pencils in the next step, I would need a good flat coat on the model to give the pencils a toothy surface. Using AK Interactive's Real Colors Flat Varnish, I airbrushed a quick coat and let it dry. While I had added some rust early in the process, this would now be the central part of the weathering process for the next few steps and showing what the weathering pencils can do. As before, I would keep some of the water in a small cup nearby, and I used some wetting agent that I used earlier to thin the water that I would use for the next steps. This time, my starting point would be using the medium rust weathering pencil, wetting the tip, and then starting to add the rust color to the top of the model. I used a combination of light strokes and taps when applying the wet tip pencil, allowing for some randomness. Using the medium rust first allowed me to set the overall look, where I could then come back with the dark rust to fill in the areas, and then the light rust color could provide some accents. This locomotive has been around for a while, so there will be far more dark and medium rust to it, but there's always something new that the elements will attack. I worked section by section, and once I applied the medium rust pencil, I took a torn makeup sponge and dabbed it lightly over the area that I had just worked on. This absorbed the excess water on the model and softened out the edges. I would alternate between the weathering pencil and the sponge until I was happy with how it looked, being careful not to scrape off any of the pencil pigment. The main thing was to make the rust progression and the color look natural. Once I was happy with the medium rust, I moved on to dark rust, repeating the process, but keeping it in a narrow area across the model's middle. This would give the illusion that the rust was oldest in the center of the model's top, getting progressively lighter towards the edges. Along the sides of the model, since the spots were smaller, I used the dark rust to add some spots first and then work out from there. Some of this was experimenting with the style as I worked on the model, seeing how it looked doing it this way, and some of it was trying to replicate some prototype photos where the dark rust was the dominant color along the sides. It was applying this to taste and working with it as I went, alternating with the pencil and the sponge as I went. Once I got the hang of this, I then went back with the medium rust and worked my way down the top of the model's hood. Continuing this process, if there were some places that I wanted to rework, I used a paintbrush to apply a bit of water that I had been using to shape the weathering pencil's look further. I took a second round of rust work as there was some cleanup and detail that I wanted to improve on a day after I did the first round. I started with the thinned water to reconstitute some of the previous day's work and used the brush to manipulate the pigment to blend the edges a little further. There were some edges where the pigment had dried from the previous day, just a bit too light for my taste. So I wanted to fix that and perhaps try a few more things before moving on to the next step. One significant advantage of weathering pencils is this ability to reconstitute dried pigment with a small amount of water. This way I can apply it, manipulate it, let it dry, and see if I like it. And if I don't, it just takes a brush and a bit of water to come back and rework the areas even a few days later. This makes the pencils rather forgiving to work with. Since it dries quickly, I don't have to wait long to see if I like the results or not. For much of this part, I decided that I needed more dark rust than what I had applied the day before, so much of what you see here is making extensive use of a wet application of that particular pencil. I focused on specific rust patterns that the Alco S4 prototype showed and added some rust to the lower battery boxes and truck. Before moving on to the sponge, I made sure to use a brush to reapply some water where I wanted the sponge to soften the edges. While weathering pencils can be used for doing rust streaks rather well, I wanted to do this with oils. However, instead of using a gloss coat, I decided that a satin coat would be a better choice for getting that smeared look I was aiming for. AK Interactive Satin Varnish is suitable for this step. While the clear coat was drying, I took a bit of time to work on the handrails. Setting them on a piece of paper, I used Games Workshop's Skavenblade Dinge, Mornfang Brown, and Scrag Brown with a sponge to get this discolored rust effect. This process is precisely the same as what you saw earlier. Having the handrails on a piece of paper made this more comfortable for me to see and apply the paint. Holding the handrails down with my fingers and sponging on the colors so I wouldn't have to worry about accidentally bending anything that shouldn't be bent. Ultimately, I decided to do the rust streaks on the model with oils, and while I can do the streaks with the weathering pencils, the Abteilung oils were the better choice for the look that I was aiming for. and they are available through AK Interactive's website and again can be considered one of their products. Using dark rust and light rust, I sought to create some distinct streaking effects along the sides, with a little bit in a few places across the top. I used the dark rust straight, while then I mixed the dark rust with some light rust on the palette to get a good medium rust color. To get the streaks is easy. Using a small brush, I applied dark rust dots to various places I wanted the streaks to start across the model. Once I was happy with the placement, I used downward strokes with a flat, dry brush to draw the oil pigment down the model. And after I did that, I came back with a small brush with some thinner to manipulate around the pigment, particularly around the lower front and back of the model, to flow into corners and other places that water might accumulate. The last part of this step was to use the medium rust blend and light rust to add accent points. Where some of the dark streaks that I had already applied, I then added some of these lighter dots, and then a couple places where I felt there needed to be some accents for interest. The process was the same, adding dots and using a flat, dry brush to draw down the streaks. Once I completed this step, it was on to the flat clear coat. The next steps would be adding some patches or creating the effect of replaced doors. Since this would be done with acrylic paints and an airbrush, the surface needed a bit of tooth, which would protect the oil. AK Interactive's flat varnish was the choice for this step. Masking is tedious, but it can be rewarding. My process here would be two steps. The first was to create the impression that some of the panel doors on the locomotive's left side had been replaced. Since Union Pacific had acquired Southern Pacific, it made sense that the doors would have come from a similar unit that had been scrapped. I did the primary masking with regular Tamiya masking tape while using delicate painter's tape to cover up the rest of the model. Because the model is so dark, I first airbrushed the doors with a gray color to cover up the markings underneath it and to prepare it for the yellow. Lighter colors like red and yellow can have trouble covering darker colors. Since I wanted the yellow doors to be quite distinctive, the gray would provide a good base for the yellow in the next step, showing the Union Pacific roots. From the previous step, I used AK Interactive's Real Colors Yellow to finish off the door colors. It's an excellent match to the Union Pacific Armor Yellow. Now here's a little bit of trivia. Union Pacific never owned any Alco S4s in their fleet, but they did have plenty of S2s. Externally, these locomotives are almost identical, so it is plausible that the doors from a scrapped S2 could have found their way onto this S4. I wasn't done with the additional paint. After all, this locomotive was no longer in service to either Southern Pacific or Union Pacific and had become a dedicated switcher for the steel mill on Will's layout. Will didn't have a steel mill logo yet, so we decided to play around with some ideas. I wanted to have it distinct and stand out, so I suggested a red diamond shape with white lettering over it. Some of the decals that Will had sent me were for the St. Louis Southern Railway, sometimes known as the Cotton Belt. In rearranging the SSW letters to SWS, we could create a company called Southwestern Steel. I used masking tape to create a diamond shape on each side and a smaller one on the locomotive's front to make the diamond. I used the same reference points on each side to get the diamond shape to line up correctly. While I was at it, I also masked around the cab's road numbers, as this locomotive would receive a single-digit road number. Once I was happy with the shape, I used light tack masking tape to cover up the rest of the model to prevent overspray. Airbrushing the patches was reasonably quick. I started with AK Interactive's red, spraying down the diamond shapes, and I tried to keep this in light layers as too much paint all at once can look terrible. Instead, I lightly airbrushed each area, slowly building up the color on each diamond. I then returned and did a second lap with the red until I was happy with the result. Moving on to flat black, I quickly cleaned out the airbrush first and covered up the road number. After removing the tape, the fresh red and black patches stand out against the wear and tear of the model. Still, even these would need to see a bit of weathering, but we would have to apply the decals first. When doing decals on specific areas of a model, it works just as well to apply a bit of brush-on gloss varnish to where the decals would go. The red diamonds and the areas where a new road number will go underneath the cab windows. The decals were pretty straightforward. I sliced up the SSW so I could arrange the letters to SWS and applied them carefully to make sure that the letters were centered correctly on the red diamonds and that they lined up. As usual, I find I get more control over smaller decals by brushing water onto them on the cutting mat rather than letting them sit and soak in the water. After the logo decals had dried, I then applied a single digit as a road number to the black patches on either side of the cab. Since this locomotive would be serving in a steel mill, Will wanted to have it as a single digit. 3 as a number was not a good idea given that it is the default number on DCC decoders. So for a few reasons, we decided that this engine would receive the number 9. Off camera, I applied microsol and resealed the decals with brush-on gloss varnish, getting them ready for the next step. I brushed over not just the decals, but everywhere I had patched with yellow, red, or black. Now that the decals had dried with the gloss coat, it was time to weather them slightly. The first part of this would be accenting the panel lines of the fresh colors. I wanted to do this quickly, and I had recently acquired a few of Tamiya panel line accent bottles. It works just the same as a Pinwash, and it is in the same broad family as oil-based weathering products. In other words, I was using mineral spirits as a thinner rather than water. These bottles are so quick because they have a small built-in brush that makes application quick and easy. I used the brown panelite accent on the yellow doors and black for the red diamonds. As with other pin washes, the idea is to selectively apply to the details that I wanted and emphasize and let the fluid's natural capillary reaction draw the pigment around it. Since this was primarily a targeted wash and not across the whole model, it didn't take long for this to dry. However, while it was drying, I decided to add a signature bit of rust bleeding that almost all Alco S4 units seem to have on the back part of the cab. It's on the left side. I used dark oil rust paint straight out of the tube, dipping a small brush in the pigment in the end of the tube, and then applying it to the model. As with the panel line washes, I would be coming back to soften and streak this. As with other pin washes, the second step requires softening the wash. It dries quicker than other oil-based methods that I've used, so I didn't have to wait long. Using a soft brush, I blended out any tide marks, using a bit of thinner on a small brush as necessary if they had dried too much. I worked on this until I was happy with how it looked. I also took the opportunity to smear the rust oil paint that I applied in the previous step to get that small signature bit of rust looking right, but as you'll see, I wasn't quite happy with it. Since I would be going back to the weathering pencils for the next step, I would need to have a flat clear coat in place so that the pencils would adhere better to the model. Again, sticking to AK Interactive products, I used their flat clear varnish from their Real Colors line. While I wouldn't be attaching the sunshades with the model, I still needed to drill the appropriate holes in the cab and apply paint. I used Stynylres's black primer to paint the sunshades right on the brass sprue. I used a sheet of white paper behind the sprue so that I wouldn't get overspray all over my cutting mat. And this didn't take too long at all. I did a series of light coats rather than trying to get the primer on all at once. One of the signature features that Will asked for on this locomotive was to include a couple of uniquely shaped rust spots and a bit of damage along the cab. Here I used a mostly wet application of the weathering pencils to draw this out on the model. I started with dark chipping for wood to do the first stage of the battery box rust and the cab scrapes. It may seem to be an odd choice for this step, but it matched most of the extensive parts of the chipped and rust sections in the pictures that Will had sent me. I used this to draw out the overall shape where I wanted the rust and chip paint to go, and then I would come back with the darker colors as I went. I find with the weathering pencils that I can work back and forth between colors reasonably quickly because the pencils don't contaminate each other as easily as paint on the end of a brush. As with previous steps, I used a damp sponge to soften the edges of where I had applied the pencil to give it more of a natural shape. I also went back to where I had applied the oils earlier with the Pinwashes. Here I had a direct comparison with the oils, and in this case, the pencils came out on top as I found I had better control to create the look I was aiming for. Using the rust-colored weathering pencils, I applied rust to the upper side of the sunshades, and while I could have done it for the underside, I wanted to make it clear to Will which side was up. A handy little trick that I started using at this point was to use air from my airbrush to quickly dry the water of the wet-tipped pencils had left behind. It was better to do this from a bit of a distance as I didn't want to spread the water around just to dry it off. It's a handy trick because it sped up the process quite a bit, and I expect to do it more in future weathering projects. I then took a damp brush to soften the weathering pencils from the previous step, trying to do some very light streaking with any of the thicker pigments. And once this was done, it was time to put it all back together, but I wasn't done just yet. But these last steps needed to have the railings in place. As the next steps dealt with dust, it was time to put the railings back onto the model. This proved trickier than expected, but once they were on, it was time to move on to the last dust stages in a few different forms. One notable feature about locomotives that work in steel mills is zinc oxide dust. The smelting process generates all kinds of particulates that drift through the air and settle on surfaces. And while iron oxide contributes to that rusted look, zinc oxide has a distinctive grayish-white color. Look at prototype pictures of locomotives working in steel plants, and there's this telltale grayish-white fade across the top flat surfaces. I used a mix of flat white and flat clear as my colors for this. For this step, I would be using my airbrush to provide an even coat sprayed lightly down over the top of the model as it sits upright on the spray stand. In this case, I wanted to focus on the flat surfaces and avoid the vertical ones as much as possible. I also included the sunshades in this step, as the zinc oxide dust would settle on them. Once I did this, I quickly cleaned out the airbrush, switched to flat black, and applied some light soot stains around the stacks and grills. As this is a switcher, I didn't have the usual soot stripe running down the roof center that would effectively erase everything that I've already done. Still, since this locomotive was making slow speed switching moves, the soot would pool around the stack and run down the side. This is a subtle nod because this locomotive is a local workhorse and never destined for the main line. Details like this help tell its story. Using the AK Interactive's Train's undercarriage weathering set, I used both light dust deposits and shafts bearing grease enamels to do the finishing touches on Will's model. I applied the dust first by shaking the bottle well, using a fine brush to apply to the points in the model, and then softening and smearing it with a dry brush. Here I focused mostly on the lower parts of the model, the trucks, the walkways, and the lower parts of the battery boxes, as well as around and underneath the couplers. I used the shafts and bearing grease color to apply around fuel caps and around the top of the model, both near the cab and towards the hood's end. I didn't need to use a lot here, which was especially important to let it dry. This material has a slightly glossy sheen to it and is quite convincing as spilled oil. The very last step was to remove the foil window mask from very early in the process, and this tired Alco S4 was ready to return home for service in the steel mill on Will's layout. So I hope you found this as a helpful guide for your projects. Dedicated industry locomotives can offer an artistic weathering challenge. Rather than looking at general weathering patterns, it helps to get reference pictures of locomotives working in a single industry to see how their wear and tear shows. Fortunately, Will provided me with a raft of images to work with, which allowed me to create a plausible freelance locomotive working in a steel mill. So if you want more tips on how to get the most out of your weathering and painting projects, don't forget to hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you won't miss any upcoming videos. And if you haven't already, check out the other videos on this channel and some of the social media links below. Also, if you'd like seeing how Will's commission went and you want a chance to see how one of your own might look, go check out my Patreon page and you can get involved in the creative process for this channel. So thanks so much for watching, good luck, and may you keep on track.